Joe Biden is back, and nobody seems particularly happy about it, except for maybe Republicans. Democrats find their fight song on immigration by trying to bring back a deported non-citizen with ties to MS-13. All of that and more today on 10 Minute Drill.
Everybody get up, get up.
The story of America is the story of an adventure.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you.
We are a nation under God, and I believe God intended for us to be free.
We bring you a live look of Joe Biden re-emerging from hibernation. Oh, wait, that's the wrong video. Here it is.
By the way, those 300-year-old folk getting that Social Security, I want to meet them because I like to figure out how they live that. Hell of a thing, man. I'm looking for longevity.
Joe Biden stumbled and slurred through a speech on Tuesday night about Social Security, and it was a healthy reminder to his party of just what they were trying to preserve as the President of the United States. You'll remember that there was a massive cover-up operation from the Biden family and members of the Biden staff hiding his condition until it was exposed in a presidential debate with President Trump.
The total initiative relative to what we're going to do with more Border Patrol and more asylum officers.
President Trump?
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either.
Joe Biden coming back to the world stage with this speech reminded everybody of the disasters that he left behind, some of which we're going to talk about today. Earlier this week, Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen, along with Cory Booker and others, announced plans to go down to South America to stand in solidarity with an illegal immigrant who was deported by the Trump administration. Here's the Trump administration's case for deporting Abrego Garcia.
Abrego Garcia was a foreign terrorist. He is an MS-13 gang member. He was engaged in human trafficking. He illegally came into our country. And so deporting him back to El Salvador was always going to be the end result.
Now, there are complex legal issues around this case and around the deportation. The Supreme Court and district courts are discussing this right now. They're arguing that the White House didn't have the authority to deport him because of a 2019 stay on his deportations. But the White House maintains, one, that he has credible ties to MS-13. Those ties were also found by an immigration judge back in 2019. The White House also argues that the conditions that prevented him from being deported in 2019, that a particular street gang put his life in danger, that gang no longer exists. So the White House says that threat no longer is there, and so they had the ability to deport him. Legal issues aside, I really want to examine this more from the sort of political PR standpoint. Democrats have spent the last 4 years doing everything possible to facilitate this immigration crisis. They stood in the way of any bills that would make it easier to deport criminals who made it across our southern border. And now for them to first find their voices in service of going down to South America to try and bring back a dangerous criminal illegal immigrant is a little bit absurd. We know right now from new polling, Harvard Caps Harris shows 74% of Americans approve of President Trump's deportation plans. That came out just this week. Democrats are putting so much more energy into bringing back a non-citizen who has alleged ties to MS-13, who had a deportation order. They're putting so much more energy into bringing him back into our country than they ever put into trying to remove any of the dangerous criminal illegal immigrants that have gotten into our country under their watch in the last 4 years. And Chris Van Hollen himself stood in the way of deporting any of these people. I'd note that Chris Van Hollen has never said a word, never tweeted, never even attended the funeral of Rachel Morin, his own constituent from Maryland, who was murdered at the hands of a dangerous criminal illegal immigrant. We know what this is about. Democrats have been urged by their base to do something, to find their voices on anything. They shuffled from building to building in the federal government to protest any cuts to the federal government, and their approval ratings only went down. It's very hard to imagine this going down to South America to try and bring back deported criminal illegal immigrants will help their approval rating anymore. And I would just close by noting that as Chris Van Hollen was getting on a plane to go to South America to bring back an illegal immigrant, another illegal immigrant was released by Prince George's County, Maryland, who was wanted for murder after twice being deported and finding his way back into the country, in part thanks to the efforts of Senator Chris Van Hollen. This Abrego Garcia, Chris Van Hollen flap highlights one of the major challenges left behind by Joe Biden, particularly to the rule of law. There was little or no vetting at all of the tens of millions of illegal immigrants that crossed our border and came into our country. But now judges are saying that there needs to be intensive vetting for every single one of them as they're being deported out of the country. And at the same time, more than 70% of Americans want illegal immigrants deported, and about 90% want those illegal immigrants with criminal records deported. The problem is the legal system hinders our ability to do any of that quickly. This is a very similar principle to what we see with spending programs. A federal judge in Rhode Island ruled on Tuesday night that President Trump has to resume distributing grants from programs like the Inflation Reduction Act that have been frozen. That comes at the same time as inspectors general have warned that those programs are rife with waste, fraud, abuse, and little protection against conflicts of interest that allow our tax dollars to go back to Democrat allies like Stacey Abrams, whose group received $2 billion in our tax dollars to fight climate change. So again, President Biden, with massive swipes of his pen, however slowly, was able to force so much into law, knowing so much of it would be difficult to unwind, that it was nearly impossible to get that toothpaste back in the tube once he put it out there. And that is a major challenge to our institutions and to the rule of law.
Today, the Department of Justice is announcing a civil lawsuit against the Maine Department of Education. The state of Maine is discriminating against women by failing to protect women in women's sports. Pretty basic stuff.
Joining Attorney General Bondi on the dais there is Maine Representative Laurel Libby, who we've talked about before on this show. You'll remember that Representative Libby went viral when she announced that a biological male had won the Maine Women's High School Pole Vaulting Championship. The biological male who won that had competed as a male 1 year before. Laurel Libby was censured by the Maine House of Representatives and lost her right to vote on behalf of her constituents. So she stood with the Attorney General to demand change and demand that Maine Governor Janet Mills protect women's sports.
It's unfortunate that we have to be here today because Governor Mills and legislative Democrats, along with the Maine Principals Association, continue to persist in discriminating against Maine women and girls. They are out of alignment with 2/3 of Mainers who believe that biological males have no place in girls' sports.
As President Trump has noted, and as polling has made clear now for several years, protecting women's sports is a wildly popular issue. About 80% of Americans believe that only women should be allowed to compete in women's sports. Unfortunately, Maine Governor Janet Mills appears to be in that narrow 20%. We will see how long she holds out, because it seems that she believes that allowing men to play in women's sports is more important than receiving that federal funding to help Maine students. Earlier this week, President Trump announced that they were freezing all federal funds to Harvard University after Harvard announced they would not be complying with Department of Education demands that they shape up.
Students of any faith should not be illegally harassed and targeted on our nation's college campuses. And we unfortunately saw that illegal discrimination take place on the campus of Harvard. There are countless examples to prove it.
For the last several years, Harvard has been in the news for all of the wrong reasons. First, and perhaps most prominently, a massive rise in anti-Semitism on the university, particularly after October 7th. But students have come out with a number of horror stories ever since that point. Harvard University President Claudine Gay didn't make things better when she testified on Capitol Hill.
Dr. Gay, at Harvard, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment, yes or no?
It can be, depending on the context.
The university already has over a $50 billion endowment, so most people were surprised to hear that Harvard gets more than $2 billion of our federal tax dollars. But as President Trump said, if you want to receive federal government support, you have to comply with the law, both in protecting students, making and maintaining a safe atmosphere, particularly for the Jewish students who have been targeted over the last several years, but also just in general. Getting some of their racial bias programming out of the institution will go a long way. I wanted to share a couple of must-read articles of this week. First, from the Daily Caller, Nick Pope. Trump has no shortage of targets in his war against blue state climate lawfare. We've talked about that blue state climate lawfare on this show before. States have tried to sue oil and gas companies to penalize them for the damage that's come from extreme weather events. As we've described, there's little causation described there. There's little science in the attribution of, you sell oil and gas, we had bad weather, you did this. It's sort of an underpants gnome dynamic. But President Trump had an executive order last week trying to stop that. And so Nick Pope has a great article describing how some of that works. Another article we wanted to flag. Washington Free Beacon, plagiarism accusations threaten to upend Democrats' climate lawsuit against oil companies. So in a number of these lawsuits from blue states or blue cities against energy companies, there are a lot of the same lawyers working on them. And in some cases, like in Puerto Rico, 2 lawsuits have basically copied off of each other exact language, and the judge didn't really like it. And so I think that will cause major problems for a number of these lawsuits. Third, Fox News reported major university medical center accused of hiding DEI programs. Influential senator calls them out. Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee wrote a letter to Vanderbilt University Medical Center accusing them of hiding their DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and sort of woke policies and practices behind passwords. This was something that was revealed by the group Consumers Research just a few weeks ago. They had a major campaign, whatisvandyhiding.com, where they highlighted a number of places through the Vanderbilt University Medical Center's website where they took their long-term DEI programs, their race-based hiring programs, and simply tried to hide them, hoping that that would put them in compliance with President Trump's executive order. Senator Blackburn is calling them out and saying lawmakers should consider, before they give any more funds or before they approve any more funding to Vanderbilt University Medical Center, whether or not they're complying with President Trump's executive orders and the law on this issue. That is all the time we have for today. We covered a whole lot. Thanks so much for joining us. Please subscribe on YouTube. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Thanks so much for joining us.